Hello, welcome back to the Creating Creative Chaos podcast. So, in this episode, I was going to talk a little bit about warship classes that I think make sense in quote unquote realistic near future science fiction. Um, and this is going to build on all of the previous episodes where I was talking about weapon systems, doctrine with space combat. Um, defenses, all those sorts of things. And just kind of build on that and think about what sorts of classes of warships make sense in this scenario. But I'm going to broaden it too, because I think, and just throw out some considerations that I think make sense if you're writing science fiction, especially science fiction that includes warships or space warfare of any type. Some considerations when you're thinking about what ships to include and how to include them in your story and your world. And I think the main thing to start with is thinking about logistically how your warships are being supported in this world that you've created. Um, Now, I don't mean to say that you need to get in and create a spreadsheet and start doing cost benefit analysis calculations for every ship that you've put out there. Um, because let's face it, we're writing these stories to entertain, and there's a vanishingly small number of humans, a few, and they're all wackos, who really enjoy. That's not fair. Let me back that up a bit. I'll just say there are very few people that enjoy reading cost benefit analysis and spreadsheets, um, specifically if they're trying to read a story about science fiction, some sort of entertainment. Um, So what I mean, rather than doing that, although you can certainly do that if you write a spreadsheet or do cost benefit analysis calculations if you want to. But what I think would be more useful for the vast majority of us is just think about how this spaceship is supported by the civilizations and governments that have put it out there, and also what specific role it's designed to achieve. So what do I mean by that? Um, let me provide an example. Let's say you've got kind of your stereotypical space battleship out there, and let's say for the sake of argument that this one fires, you know, massive cannon shells at its enemies and all that sort of thing. Well, think of how it's supported. What industries are required to create not only the ship itself, but also the shells for this cannon and all that sort of thing. But then also how long the ship can actually stay out on mission and still be capable of fulfilling whatever goals it's required to fulfill in the fleet. So, for example, if you've got these massive cannons in there, I mean, obviously those are going to need shells. So you need to load shells. That's going to be add weight to your ship. How are these shells replenished? How far can this battleship go before it requires, refilling its fuel reserves or getting more crew, et cetera, et cetera. So, with all those considerations, does it make sense for A, this battleship to mount massive cannons, which I would say would no. But then B, does it make sense for the civilization to have this thing at all? If there are other ships that are smaller and cheaper that could fulfill the same mission. So, do you need a space battleship? Is what I'm going for. And if you do need one, how is it supported and what specifically is it tasked to do? Um, so with this in mind, I think a lot of the huge spaceships that we see, like I mean, the iconic Imperial Star Destroyer, for example, maybe doesn't make much sense in the context of bang for your buck with the amount of logistics that you're using to support this thing, with how capable it is with the mission parameters that it's been given. So I would just say consider that. And I think the reason for doing that is if you do spend a little bit of time thinking about, what classes of ship make sense with your government entities and what they're supposed to accomplish and the logistics behind supporting them, it actually adds that layer of realism, of grit, for lack of a better term, to your story. And I think it actually makes the stories better. Again, you don't have to write chapters and chapters on how logistically these ships were supported. But if you just include a couple of sentences in there, um, I think it adds that little layer of believability to your story, which can only help, I think, in a lot of ways. And I want to step that back a little bit too and say, like, if you don't want to do this, feel free to not do it. I mean, if you want to write, you know, stories about giant space battleships blasting away at each other with these massive cannons, like Warhammer 40K does, I mean, that's an awesome setting, and those make for pretty awesome stories. So, you know, feel free to do that if that's where your gut is telling you, and if you think that'll make your story better. Um, but I would say, you know, even if you're doing that, at the very least, have it in the back of your mind, just a little bit of thinking about how realistically these ships are supported and what classes of ships you need. Um, so having said that, if you watched any of my episodes before this, and if you haven't, I would encourage you to go back, you know, and just take a look at them, just so you can see what world I'm basing this on. Um, but I was going to jump into Regnum Humanitas and start thinking about realistically what spaceship classes the Solar Confederation would need and use to fulfill its military obligations throughout the solar system. Um, just very quickly, in a nutshell, the major weapon systems that are used are torpedoes. Um, Main defenses are laser clusters for close-in defense. Uh, High-speed missiles to intercept torpedoes far away, and then stealth is a big way that spaceships protect themselves from detection and attack. Um, and this includes heat sinks, radar-resistant materials, and absorbing materials, all that stuff. And then the things that these fleets are defending are static installations, you know, around major resource nodes in the solar system, like helium-3 deposits. And these installations are defended by the, you know, laser clusters, smaller warships mounting torpedoes, high-speed interceptors, um, all that. And then the main thing that these fleets are designed to accomplish is to defend these resource nodes from their opponents, um, and B, if they are going to attack, to provide a forward base of operations so that you can take over these installations with a minimum amount of damage. Because again, in Regnum Humanitas, I mean, building a helium-3 mining facility is expensive, takes a lot of time. So the last thing you want to do if you want to take one over is blow it up, because then you've got to rebuild it from scratch. So this leads to a lot of sort of asymmetric warfare where people are trying to infiltrate each other's bases, um, hack each other's defenses, like, you know, basically ways of taking over these bases with a minimum amount of damage. So that's kind of the doctrine and the tools that are set in this universe. So thinking about logistics, how would I approach what classes of ships that the Solar Confederation uses? What makes sense for them? And I've touched on this a little bit before. Oh, and I should say I'm still going to use the kind of the wet water Navy terms, just because I think we're so used to it at this point. There are several people out there that said, like, you know, well, maybe we should use avian terms. Maybe there's other terms that make more sense for spaceships and spaceship classes. And I would agree. I think if you want to go with, you know, classifying your spaceships by, say, avian terms or other terms that you've made up, uh, that's fine. That's great. I tend to use wet water Navy terms just because I'm more comfortable with it. So having said that, um, the main thing to consider with the logistics is that cryogenics play a major role in space travel in Regnum Humanitas. And the reason for that is very simple, because if you don't need your crew awake for most of the time, so you put them to sleep, and then if there's a military engagement that requires their attention, you wake them up, and then they can actually start fulfilling all their crew functions. So pretty much everything is automated up until that. And the reason that's done is very simple. It saves on logistics. You don't have to pack enough air and food and water and all that stuff to support a crew that's moving around and active if they don't need to be. So that's the first major consideration. Second major consideration is, they've also you've got to defend these resource nodes, like I talked about earlier. But the other thing that they also have to defend are trade lanes. And the reason for that is that trade in the solar system is basically revolves around these giant freighters that are in static orbit, like basically giant container ships that are in static orbit between the major colonies, like say Luna and like the Jovian system, like Europa, for example. And so they basically continuously rotate or orbit between the colonies, and they're constantly loading and offloading cargo as they do it. And what that means is that they're very easy to find, and if you were a pirate, you know exactly where these ships are going, and the impetus or the instinct there is that you just kind of wait, and then you can rob this thing and take off with all the loot fairly uh, standard, low energy, low risk way of doing things. So in order to stop that, you've actually got to kind of protect these trade lanes as well. And the last thing, and the crucial element for defending these static installations, is defense in depth. And the reason that you want to do that is because you want to make sure that you intercept potential attackers as far from your vulnerable institutions as possible. So you need to actually have a control, or at least monitor space in a pretty large volume of space beyond your core systems. So you can do that obviously with satellites, um, maybe even armed satellites. You can stick a torpedo or two on those. But the advantages of having spaceships that can do the same thing is that they can move, they can go where they're needed, and they can actually mount a lot more weapons, have a lot more flexibility. So what class of ship fulfills those needs the best? And I would say it clearly comes down to the frigate. Now, frigates in wet water navies have traditionally been ships that, they were sent out to patrol. They had long enough legs; they could stay out long enough that they could do these long range patrols to monitor different parts of the planet, patrol the trade lines on between the old world and the new world back in the 1700s, 1800s. But still mount enough of a punch, enough cannons in the case of the wet water navies to defend themselves and take out lighter units like pirates, for example. So the frigate class makes a lot of sense in this scenario. This would be the kind of the backbone, I think, and is the backbone of the Solar Confederation Navy. So very quickly, how these things are designed is they're, again, very stealthy. They've got heat sinks to take their I'm not going to get too much into this because I've done this in an earlier episode. But they've got heat sinks. They're stealthy. They mount torpedoes. They mount enough point defense that they can take care of themselves, and they can stay out for a long time because their crew is in cryogenic stasis. So basically, what you can do is you can send these frigates out to a region of space that you need monitored, and just leave them out there and have them float invisibly, one would hope, because they are very stealthy, for months, maybe even years, and just monitor this area of space. And then if something like a pirate, or if they detect a threat like a pirate or a fleet moving into their zone of control, they can wake up the crew and activate and either shadow the ship or attack this threat if they think they can take it. Okay. So it's a very cost-effective way to expand your defense zone, to make it a defense in depth, and also have resources available far out there to take care of any sort of light threats that may be, say, attacking trade lines and things like that. So the frigate makes sense. I would say that these are roughly equivalent to the attack submarines that our wet water navies are using today. They kind of fulfill that same function. They control an area of space and eliminate threats or shadow threats, monitor threats that they can't eliminate just to help out sort of the core colonies with their defensive network. So do you need anything else other than a frigate? It seems like it's doing everything you need. Well, when you start talking about taking out an enemy's core facilities or infiltrating them, um, you start thinking about, well, maybe a frigate isn't going to be the best class of ship to support that kind of operation. Because again, they don't have a lot of crew. They are stealthy, but on the other hand, if you manage to infiltrate an opposing team, an enemy's base, you're the special forces hacker that I was talking about in my previous episode manages to take over the defenses of the base and all that. A frigate really doesn't have enough uh, uh, mount enough armament to defend this base, but which you're going to have to do to make before you get everything, before you can actually get your own defenses up on this base, unless for some miracle you manage to fully transfer control over all of the base's defenses to your hacker friend. Um, I would say that would be pretty tough to do, though. I mean, you can have fail safes in there, I would imagine, to make that difficult. But the frigate isn't going to have enough crew or enough weapons to actually adequately defend a resource node once you've captured it. So you need something a little heavier. So I was thinking through there, okay, cruisers kind of sound good, larger frigates maybe. Um, and I think those do make some sort of sense. You should at least have, I would say, a couple cruisers that are basically like oversized frigates mounting the same sort of weapons and defenses. Um, and I think, having a couple of those would make sense. But again, I don't know that a cruiser, at least in my mind, would mount enough weapons to make it worthwhile to A, be able to provide support if you're attacking a resource node, and B, um, for bang for your buck, I don't know that those make a lot of sense as anything other than up jumped patrol ships, like up jumped frigates. So battleships don't make much sense. I keep coming back as I think about it. I keep coming back to the concept of aircraft carriers, or more specifically, drone carriers. And when I was thinking about it, I think if you're talking about bang for your buck, as far as how much logistical support you need to support one of these large, expensive warships, you get a lot more bang for your buck, I think, with a carrier type of craft. Um, and when I'm talking about carriers, I'm not saying it doesn't make much sense to stick a human in a fighter, to be perfectly honest. It makes a lot more sense to have these things be drones. Because A, you can pull a lot more high G maneuvers in a drone if you don't have to worry about plastering your human all over the bulkhead. And B, you're close enough into this to your command ship that that the light speed communications can actually be pretty, I would say, effective. You would still have some lag, but you would assume that a lot of these drones would have their own, kind of attack programming. So you just need to update it as circumstances dictate. So I was thinking a large ship that mounts a lot of drones uh, with enough cryogenic facility to support, say, a small armed Marine team that you could send in to help uh, control a facility that you've managed to infiltrate, and a large enough space frame that it can mount a lot more torpedoes and interceptor missiles and laser clusters, Gatling turrets if you're using that turrets if you're using those, to make it almost like a mobile space station that's going to be a lot harder for existing any defenses for these facilities that have survived, or any even warships that are in the vicinity, enemy warships that are in the vicinity, that you can kind of neutralize them because you're packing a lot more weaponry. Um, and then the other thing that these drones do, and these drones I kind of envision, having them mount like a laser cluster just to provide sort of point defense, but also, at least a couple torpedoes so that they can actually extend the engagement envelope of your drone carrier. Um, so you're creating a defense in depth, a movable defense in depth for your carrier, which in a lot of ways is sort of functioning as a mobile space station, mounting the same sorts of defenses. Um, and I think that makes a lot more sense from a logistical standpoint than, say, having a battleship with these things. Um, as far as support, I think, maybe those cruisers I was talking about earlier, you might want, maybe that would work. But I almost think that having, if you're going to provide any support with it, maybe a destroyer class of ship would make some sense with that. And this would be a fast ship that can get away from the drone carrier. It can extend the engagement envelope fairly quickly. Stealthy, but not as stealthy as a frigate, and mounting a lot more weapons with a smaller crew. And then again, a lot of point defense. And again, the idea behind the drones and any sort of destroyer class ships is that you're going to create a wider engagement area, a wider uh, defensive depth around your kind of valuable, vulnerable drone carrier. Um, Now with this, you can do stealth issues. I mean, it doesn't make much sense not to. I mean, sure, put heat sinks on it and make it radar reflective or radar absorbing materials for the hull. But that's not going to be its primary defense. Its primary defense is going to be sort of the same that you would use for your static installations, the defense in depth thing, which I keep talking about. Um, and so that I think is kind of the core of the Solar Confederation Navy, as I see it. A kind of a core of frigates that you send out to control and patrol, large areas of space, create like a defense in depth around your core installations. And then a drone carrier, which kind of provides the heavy, the muscle behind your fleet. And there's not many of them, but these drone carriers obviously mount combat drones, have a small contingent of say marine analogs in cryogenic stasis along with the crew, um, to provide sort of on-ground support if you do manage to take out the defenses of a enemy facility. And they mount a lot more torpedoes so they can engage a lot more targets, can outshoot, say, enemy frigates, for example. And then, if you need it, I think probably I would include something like this, escort vessels, like maybe say a destroyer analog. This would be something that's fast, can outfight a frigate, mounts a lot more point defense than a frigate, and it's again designed to kind of extend the defenses around your kind of vulnerable drone carrier. And I'm still on the fence with cruisers. I think cruisers do make sense if you need some sort of heavier frigate out there. Um, Maybe they make sense as a support for this drone carrier as well. I don't know. But at least as far as I'm envisioning, they don't make sense as being kind of the core of your fleet. Um, so again, this is just kind of an example of how I did things. And if you do think a little bit about your fleet and the different classes of ships, what missions they're supposed to accomplish and how they're supported, I think it'll make for a better story. Um, so, but again, if you want to go with giant star destroyers blasting each other, those are good stories too. But if you do want to add a little bit of a layer of grit and realism to your stories, just consider what I just talked about here today. And when you're designing your space fleet, and yeah, and hopefully you find the Regnum Humanitas fleet, the Solar Confederation fleet, kind of a good example of the kind of space fleet that would lend itself to these sort of gritty, realistic in quotes environments. Okay, so that's that. I think for my next episode, I'm gonna talk about aliens. I've been kind of my thing that woke me up last night at 3 in the morning was like, hey, I wonder why aliens are always bipedal. And so I have some thoughts on that. I'll let them percolate for a little bit, and I'll maybe talk about those in my next episode. All right, so you folks have a good day. stay cool socially and physically, right? Bye.